Welcome to How to Reach the West Again, a podcast that aims to inspire and empower a fresh missionary encounter with Western culture. I'm your host, Brandon O'Brien. In this season of the podcast, we're focused on cities. What are they? What does the Bible say about them? How do we plant churches there? What does it mean to really love our cities? In today's episode, Tim Keller looks closely at what the Bible has to say about cities. He finds that the Bible offers a balanced view of cities, one that's neither unduly pessimistic nor naively optimistic. He argues that because cities play such an important role in human culture making, they are a critical context for God's mission to make all things new. Next, we're joined by Andrew Katay from Sydney, Australia, who suggests a missiological approach to reaching cities in a way that's culturally resonant with complex and diverse populations. But first, Tim Keller.
Part of the DNA of city to city has always been what we call city vision. And city vision is what it sounds like. It's looking at the city through the lens of the Bible, as it were, through the spectacles of the Bible, and getting a vision for not only reaching cities, loving and serving and reaching cities, but even a vision of what cities are. So the Bible tells us a great deal about what cities are and how we should regard them, and then also how to minister to people in them. The fact of the matter is that on different continents, cities are seen differently. So there are some continents and some countries and some regions in which the average person sees cities in a very positive way. They say, well, if you could live in a city, then you're important, then you're somebody. There's also, at the other end of the spectrum, there's North America, where Redeemer, the original Redeemer Church, started. And in North America, there's very much an anti-urban bias, especially amongst evangelicals. And therefore, when Redeemer got started, I, as the pastor, had to deal with the negative attitudes that people had toward the city. The reality is that the Bible is almost perfectly balanced, as we're going to show you in just a second. That the Bible is very realistic about what's wrong with the city and the flaws of it and the dangers of it, but also sees the positive, sees the blessing, sees the goodness that the city can do and bring to people. And therefore, no matter where you are in the world, the biblical vision of the city, you can use it on your people. Because if people have too naively positive a view of the city, you can show them what the Bible says about the dangers, spiritual dangers of it. If like myself, if you're in North America where so many Christians have such negative views of the city, then you can use the parts of the Bible that talk about its importance and the positive things that can happen there. So the Bible has something for all of us. We have to contextualize it, as it were. That is, we have to use it in the particular way that our particular communities need. But let me say, in the paper, the first thing we do is we look at what the Bible says about the city diachronically. Now, to read the Bible diachronically is to read it along the storyline of the Bible from beginning to end. That's what diachronic means. It means to read from Genesis to Revelation. And when you read the Bible like that about cities, when you say, well, what does Genesis and Exodus say about cities? What does Psalms and Isaiah say about cities? What does the Gospels say about cities? What does Revelation say about cities? That's what we're doing. When you do that, you'll see that in the beginning, cities are actually seen in a fairly negative light. By the middle of the Bible, they're seen in a more positive light. And by the end of the Bible, they're seen in a most positive light. And that's pretty interesting. So let me explain what I mean. In the very beginning, the first city is built by Cain. Okay, that's not a great recommendation. And you see even in Genesis 4 that the first civilization starts coming out of cities where they develop tools and agriculture and all sorts of other kinds, and they develop art and music. But you can also see there's a violence to it because the city of Cain, the civilization leads to violence. When you get to the Tower of Babel, that was a city being built. That was a skyscraper. And of course, we know that was done to make a name for ourselves. That's what they did. Then you have the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham and Lot, they divided, and Lot went into the city, and Abraham stayed out of the city, and it was better for Abraham to stay out of those cities. And so, and even when you get to Exodus, you see that the Israelites are enslaved in order to build cities. So cities are seen in a very negative way. They're places where human beings come together to glorify themselves, to make a name for themselves, to oppress, where the rich and the powerful oppress those who are not. But then when you get to when Israel is brought back to the Promised Land, suddenly cities in the Bible take on a different, you might say there's a different aspect. For example, God did not want Israel to be a completely rural society. He demanded that they build what he called cities of refuge, 6 cities, where if somebody was, if someone accidentally killed somebody else, they could run to that city where they could get protected. And the whole idea behind that is this, that it's in cities where jurisprudence begins, where civilization begins. Because people are living together, they have to develop ways of people living closely compacted together can live. And therefore, out in the countryside, if somebody accidentally kills somebody else, well, that family might just come and just kill that other family. But if you go to the city, that's where they have judges and they have lawyers and they have a way of dealing with complaints, because you can't live in a city without a way of adjudicating complaints. That's why God says, I want you to build cities, because cities build culture and cities build jurisprudence and cities develop human culture. And then, of course, God says, I want Jerusalem to be an urban society that's the joy of the whole earth. So, and even when the Jews go into exile, when they get to Babylon, they're told to pray for the peace of the city and to do everything they can while they're there for its prosperity. And so in the middle part of the Bible, we don't see this negativity toward the city you see in the early part. It doesn't mean that the city isn't still a bad place. It's no contradiction. But at the same time, it's showing that there are other aspects of the city that maybe we didn't see just in the book of Genesis and Exodus. Then finally, we get to the New Testament, and you'll see not only Jesus ministering in the city, he ministered in the Decapolis, which was 10 cities on the northern part of just outside, actually, of Judea. He ministered in the place where there were it was very urban. Decapolis means 10 cities. And he ministers there a lot. But Paul in particular, we see in the book of Acts, would target cities. He would plant a church in the biggest city in an area, like Philippi, in order to reach Macedonia. He'd plant churches in Philippi, and then he would leave the region, because he knew if you change the city, you change the region, because the city is the center of the region. And when you get to Revelation, you eventually see that in the end, when God creates a new heavens and new earth, a culture that is perfectly God-glorifying and a perfect culture for human flourishing, you know what you have? You have a city, the New Jerusalem. Diachronically, you're reading the Bible across you're reading along the plot line. Synchronic is a word that means topically. What does the Bible actually tell you about cities? And the answer is these things. First of all, cities are good. That is, they're places where they're places of refuge and security. Why do you think immigrants go into cities? If an immigrant is coming to a new country, they go to cities because there's more people like them there that speak their language. There's newspapers in their language. There's restaurants, and there's civic associations. And cities are places of refuge for people who don't have as much cultural cachet in a particular country. Secondly, cities are good because they are places where culture is developed. Gerhardus Voss explains why cities are both good and bad. And he says at one place, cities, while the accumulator of the energy of culture, cities are also an accumulator of the potencies of evil. Now, the idea of a city as an accumulator, it's another way of saying the cities are like a magnifying glass. What a magnifying glass does is it can concentrate the beams of the sun, onto a piece of paper, and it goes, into flame. In the same way, cities are not actually good or evil. Cities are magnifications of human nature, which means cities are, in the cities you see humanity at its best, and you also see humanity at its very worst. Because cities are the accumulator of human nature. They're the magnifiers of human nature. And therefore, cities are incredibly good. You can see the best almost of everything that human beings can produce in cities. And they're also the very worst. There can be tremendous poverty, tremendous corruption, tremendous racism, tremendous crime. And so instead of blaming cities for the bad or romanticizing cities for the good, we need to see what we actually have in cities, as cities bringing out what's in the human heart. And that's the reason why we can say cities are good, cities are bad, but most of all, cities are important. They're important for the culture. That is to say, generally speaking, the changes that happen to human culture happen in cities, and they spread out to the rest of culture. So human cities tend to drive culture, and therefore they are important to human society. But they're also crucial for ministry, because if you reach a city, then you can reach the society. If you like in the small town, you might reach the lawyers, one or two lawyers. But it's in the city that you reach the legal profession, because that's where the law schools are, that's where the guilds are. See? And therefore, by going into the city, even though city ministry is much more complicated and much more difficult and much more expensive, and like I said, much more complex than other kinds of ministry, it's really, really important. And the Bible calls not all Christians to go to cities, but the Bible does call some Christians to go to cities and all Christians to care about cities. So let me just end like this. At the end of the book of Jonah, God is, he's rebuking Jonah, because Jonah went to Nineveh only out of, he was forced to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to this great city filled with pagans. He didn't want to be there. And when he finally went, he preached, and a lot of them repented, and then God didn't destroy the city, and he got Jonah really angry. Jonah didn't even want to go and preach to Nineveh. But when it turns out that, he thought, well, maybe if I preach to Nineveh and they turn away, God will destroy them. But when God decides not to destroy them, he gets very angry. And at the very end, God is saying, you care about the plant that I grew up around your head. Why in the world aren't you concerned about the city with 120,000 people who don't know their right hand from their left? At the very end, he says, I am concerned. He says, should I not be concerned about this city? That's the last thing he says in the book of Jonah. He says to Jonah, shouldn't I be concerned? Shouldn't I have compassion on the city? Look at all those people. Here's the point. Not every Christian is called to go into the city, but city to city is filled with people who feel called to live in the city and minister to the city. And you know what God is saying there at the end of the book of Jonah? He's saying, I'm already there. I'm already concerned. I was concerned about the city before you were. I was having compassion on the city before you were. I was already working in the city before you were. And now that you're here, I just want you to know I've gone before you and paved your way.
So my name is Andrew Katay. I'm the CEO of City City Australia, which is part of City City Asia Pacific, which is part of City City Global, which is supported by Redeemer City City.
That seems like a very appropriate introduction. Thank you. Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. This is season 2 of the How to Reach the West Again podcast, and our entire season is dedicated to the city. So we're talking about how to understand our cities, how to love and serve our cities, what happens when we prioritize different, whether the city center or the margins in church planting and those kinds of things. So we're excited to have you on to talk about your experience in Sydney.
Great to be here.
Great, thank you. So you will have to endure questions from an American about Australia. But I think one of the things that's helpful to establish early on is that different parts of the world do have different perceptions of urban life. America has a fairly long, almost since its origin, urban-rural divide. And I'm wondering if Australia has something similar, or if as a society, Australia tends to demonize urban places, romanticize them, or kind of maybe at a high level, what's the sort of national relationship to Australia's cities?
Well, so there's a couple of different factors in that actually are in tension with each other. Australia was began as a penal colony in New South Wales and then in Victoria. And so it began as what we would now call urban centres, and developed in that way, in such a way actually that there's a lot of competition and feeling at one level between those different urban centres. And Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world.
In terms of population distribution?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's something like 80% or 90% of the population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, for example. So the cities are all clustered around the coast. We've got a great big desert in the middle. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the wealth of Australia, and at one point, I think Melbourne was the wealthiest city in the world during the gold rush in the 1850s. And so the wealth of Australia has been built what we used to describe as on the sheep's back. So wool and wheat, and more recently minerals and coal and gas and so on. So mining have led to an enormous wealth creation in Australia. And all of that, of course, is not urban. That's all not just even regional, but remote.
Right.
And so there's a lot of mythology in Australia around rural and remote areas, and the sort of the rugged Australian, not quite the same rugged individualist of the pioneer American, but the Australian who just toughs it out and battles against the odds and beats the elements and so on. And so it's quite an interesting dynamic actually, the whole rural and regional vis-a-vis city thing, when we're both I think one of the most urbanised countries in the world and have been for years. But at the same time, much of the wealth of Australia has been built on mining and primary industry.
Am I right to assume that in more recent years even there's been a lot of migration to Australian cities from other parts of the world? Right.
So all across the Western world, population growth is declining. Reproduction rates are catastrophically low, and there are many countries that are sort of falling off a population cliff. It's only immigration-rich countries that are growing, and Australia's been one of those. One of the interesting things about that is that part of our immigration policy includes sending migrants out to regional centres, and partly that's to do with house pricing within the urban centres and so on. But and also making sure that there are jobs in the regional centres. I had a lovely story recently where we saw an entire town band together to create a Facebook ad for a doctor, because they couldn't get a doctor to come to their town, and so they did an ad advertising their town and how much they would love their doctor if someone would come and be a doctor for them. Yeah. So
tell me about Sydney in that landscape of, as you kind of described, as kind of competing cities. What's the sort of city identity or personality?
Well, classic firstborn is and really literally firstborn, which means that Sydney never really talks about anywhere else because we don't care, and everyone else talks about Sydney as though they're better than Sydney, but Sydney never bothers to engage because we don't care because they're firstborn. One of our great playwrights, David Williamson, described Sydney as the Emerald City, and partly because we have this harbour, which is, in an unbiased way, I'm happy to say the greatest harbour in the world, and is absolutely beautiful. The beaches and the foreshores all along the harbour are just quite ridiculously stunning, and so glistens emerald. But it's like that too. It's a little bit superficial. It's young money, if I can put it like that, not old money. The old money's in Melbourne.
Okay.
It's to whatever degree Australia gets entrepreneurial, which is not very. There's a lot of that in Sydney. It's flashy, it's superficial, it's thin, and it's interesting. There's a move that's called sea change or green change. That is people now leaving the city just in the last couple of years, particularly post-pandemic, because of the opportunities for remote work.
Yeah.
It means that you can do your city job but not be in the city.
Yeah.
The other thing to say is that we're here in London, and it is one of the great cities of the world, along with New York and Paris and so on. And the key, I think, to those cities is that they have mixed land use in the city, both residential, plus retail plus commercial, all mixed in together. There isn't no Australian city that really has pulled that off yet.
Okay.
And so our central business district, the commercial centre, just really still empties out very much at night. I mean, I have some friends who minister in the city, and they keep telling me how many people there are there, but there really aren't. If you walk around at night, there's just hardly any people who live in the area. And so it's a bit of a donut arrangement. Sydney is sort of 50 kilometres on a semicircle, north, west and south.
Okay.
East, of course, is the ocean. But there's a donut right in the centre, which is the business district. So people commute in, do their work, and then commute home.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual life of the city itself, and what you'll call centre city, that's not quite the same as these great cities like Paris and New York and London.
Very interesting. You've described how, despite that sort of overview of the city, that the city of Sydney doesn't really function as a whole unit, but that it functions more as kind of a patchwork of a number of different subcities. Can you just unpack that? Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah. I guess like many large urban areas, and Sydney's not huge, but it's not tiny either, 5 million. That's just too many people, really, to all be homogenous. And so what happens is that different, you might call demographic, or go slightly deeper in that, ethnographic, or what we'll maybe talk about later on, slightly deeper in that, is spiritually divergent communities form with different sets of values, different hopes and aspirations and desires and fears and personal identity and so on. And that our city in Sydney, and we've done this in Melbourne and in the other Australian cities as well, really function as these clusters of what we've called sub-cities, where the people of that area, and it can be quite close. It can be one railway line or one major highway that separates from one side to the other.
Sure.
And really everything changes. Ethnic makeup changes. We had a recent vote on same-sex marriage as a plebiscite.
Okay.
And the area that had the highest yes vote bordered the area that had the highest no vote, so that you could actually throw a tennis ball from one to the other, and yet they function just quite separately as communities, quite different values, quite different aspirations, quite different sensibilities, and so what this just means is that from a missiological point of view, that the approach that needs to be taken in each of these areas will just need to be at least a little bit different. If it's the same all over, you'll be missing people, and the people who do marketing know this. And so newspapers, for example, are quite different in different sections of the city. You can tell where a person lives almost by what newspaper they read. There's the conservative newspapers. There's the lower middle class news, and so on. It's just each of these different areas function. So there's the Northern Beaches area, and you can imagine these are Northern Beaches. They're extremely laid back. It's very relaxed. It's quite a lot, quite wealthy. So it's easy to be laid back when you're wealthy, but very chilled. It's surf in the morning and surf in the evening, and yet if you go out to the southwestern suburbs, Sydney's built on a basin that just gets hotter and hotter and bakes further and further away from the water that you go.
Sure.
And so prices come down. So socioeconomically, people with lower incomes move out further west. They're not talking about that sort of leisure lifestyle. It's a different lifestyle. It's a different set of, as I say, sensibilities in those areas. And mission in that area just will have to speak to different things compared to mission in the Northern Beaches or the Inner West or the Sutherland Shire and so on.
Yeah.
All of Sydney is still more or less postmodern, more or less Western in its kind of values, but there really are textural differences, texture differences between the different areas. And when you're in Sydney, right, likewise, you don't say you're from Sydney. You say you're from the Inner West or from the North Shore or from the Eastern Suburbs or wherever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So when you think about the kind of these various regions or the subcities that make up Sydney, you described how in a recent vote, sort of the most for gay marriage and the most against are bordering. Are there kind of open animosities or antagonisms between those various regions? Do they cross over for work and go back for home, or how much interconnection is there between those?
So the work thing is interesting because, and we talk about three spaces: workspace, home space, and play space. And that's interesting. Work, I think, does lead to some overlapping and some intersectionality and so on. And there have been some animosities. We had some years ago, a thing which Sydney looks back on with some level of shame and disgrace. What were called the Cronulla riots. There were open riots in the streets on Cronulla Beach.
Okay.
And that's because that was a particular place where these different ethnicities and different cultural groups actually found a point of intersection and a real antagonism, actually. On the whole, though, there isn't really that level of animosity. There's a lot of just contempt, smug and self-righteous contempt,
Right.
but it tends not to flow over into certainly not violence.
Right.
Other than that one, very rare occasion.
Yeah.
But it's got its version of the culture wars, and so there is a lot of just simply talking past one another, of contempt and dismissiveness that reinforces these boundaries, so that it reinforces the reality that Sydney doesn't function particularly as a city. These come out in sporting events as well, and so one of the main sports in Australia is called rugby league. And, there are 8 or 10 teams or something from Sydney, and they will pick up these various areas in Sydney, and then there'll be rival, moments of these clashes. And just recently, we're in our final season, and the hard-bitten, relatively low socioeconomic strugglers beat the silver-tail rich people, and there's rejoicing, and, all that kind of stuff.
And do those kinds of cultural, socioeconomic divisions play out in Sydney's churches as well? Do they fall along some of those same divisions?
Yeah, sure. Paul the Apostle describes the church in places, the church in Corinth, for example, not the church of Corinth. And a lot of the commentators will make a point of saying, of course, the church is meant to be in a place, but it's not meant to be of the place. Except, of course, the church in Corinth was too much of Corinth, right? And I often feel, actually, the church in Sydney is too much of Sydney as well. And so Sydney, which is this fairly fractured place, the church follows that, and it's quite a fractured church. Denominationally, in Sydney, the denominations have, to a significant degree, not entirely, but to a significant degree, remain gospel-centred and Bible-based. And so all the established sort of ministry that's been there since the First Fleet actually continues. There have been some newer denominations as well. As far as I can tell, although this is just changing right now, the denominations hardly talk to each other. And because Sydney's just it's just an hour and a half commute from one end to the centre sometimes, and then another hour and a half out the other side. It's just too big to really do much genuine connectivity as churches. And so that led to this concept that we're really trying to promote in City Australia, which is the connectivity needs not to be denominationally across the whole city. It needs to be within each sub-city.
Right.
And so that if you take those sub-cities, and there are, I think, probably around 20 of them, say, in Sydney, who is it that will take up the responsibility for reaching the 250 to 350,000 people in those sub-cities? It's got to be the Christian leaders, pastors and others, not only pastors, but others as well, in that sub-city saying, we love the inner west, we love the inner southwest, we love the western suburbs, whatever it might be, and to say, and we are going to take responsibility for seeing churches planted and revitalised to reach this sub-city, because we know how to talk their language, we know how to speak to their fears and hopes and desires, and if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it.
Yeah. When you're talking about fears and hopes and aspirations and sort of speaking a heart language, we're kind of moving past the language of demographics or ethnographics into what you've called a spiritual profile. So could you tell us what you have in mind when you use the term spiritual profile? What does that mean for you?
So demographics at the top level, important to know that they're the sort of fairly objective, observable facts about an area, the number of people in a household, the number of households that are rented versus owned, average income levels of the household. This is the sort of stuff you get in a census. Ethnographics is a slightly deeper level of analysis, which is what are the patterns of behaviour, spending patterns, leisure patterns, the kinds of investments that people make in relation to their kids, that are just getting a little bit deeper towards values, but again are not they're one step short of values because they're the behaviours that reflect those values.
Got it. Yeah.
Spiritual profile is really trying to get to that bottom level of saying, well, all right, let's go as far as to try and summarise on the basis of research, not just guesswork, but to summarise what are the actual values, and in particular from a missiological point of view. And this is why this I think is a useful sort of concept, because it really is missiologically driven. It's not just cultural analysis or even just city analysis. It's an attempt to do mission as is needed in the day. What are in particular the loves? If we are what we love, as has been famously said, then we need to know what the loves of people are. And Augustine said that our loves play out in our desires for the future and our fears about the future, in our joys in the present and in our sadnesses in the present. Right? These two things: the future, good or bad; the present, good or bad.
Yeah.
Desire, fear, joy, sadness. And so to try and understand what are those things for the people of a particular area. What are their desires? What are their hopes and dreams and aspirations for themselves and their children, their families? What are their fears? What are the things that they regard as their greatest nightmare? What are their joys? What are the things that really get them going because they love them so much that when they experience them, that really lights their fire? And what are the sadnesses? And so a spiritual profile is really trying to get a sense of the loves of the heart of the people of an area in a way that then will enable you to articulate the gospel, the eternal, unchanging gospel grounded in the Word of God, with all the resources that the Scriptures give us for speaking that gospel in a way that will connect in particular to those loves.
Yeah, that's great. Can you maybe give us an overview of the spiritual profile for, say, your Inner West context?
So the Inner West is a fantastically interesting place. And I think to be a good missionary in your area, you need to both love and hate. Hate is too strong. You need to both love but not love too much.
Right.
Your area. You need to love it in the sense of understand it and get why it's good, but at the same time not be seduced by it. So the Inner West in Sydney is this lovely little pocket. It's slightly out of the central business district. It's upper middle class in socioeconomics. It's very progressive. It's highly values education. It's very expensive. And so what this means is that there's a sort of a series of elements that feed into the fact that people in the Inner West often are working full-time jobs, professional jobs, both members of a couple, gay or straight, married or de facto. Both will have to work in order to pay the mortgage for the house that they're trying to buy. So they're time poor, they're stressed, they're anxious that they're sold out to the system because they're making a lot of money. And so they've got to do other things to keep their conscience kind of functioning. And so they're highly progressive in ecological terms, and so very environmentally aware. They will often look to volunteer for agencies, or at least they'll talk a good game about volunteering, but they won't have time because they're too time poor. They're often studying as well, so they're doing master's degrees or part-time PhDs, and so they're combining full-time work with both elements of a couple, doing extra study, often trying to raise kids. Really interesting, they're highly progressive in their opinions, although not with relation to their kids. And so there's a real resurgence in sending kids to independent schools, which are much less progressive than the government schools in the area. The government schools are highly progressive on the sexuality and transgender issues, but the thousands of kids are literally pouring out of these government schools and into independent schools.
Interesting.
And so they're very family focused in a fairly nuclear kind of way. They talk a great game about community, but they're too time poor to do much about it.
Yeah.
And there's an enormous self-righteousness about all of this. There's no rest. There's anxiety. There's enormous self-righteousness at the same time as uncertainty and fear. And all of these are gospel issues, right? And so the point there is that once you've got a bit of a sense of what is the profile of an inner West person, spiritual profile, that they give you some both content as well as method or mode clues for how to do mission in an area like that.
Yeah. So just for contrast, so that people listening kind of have a sense of that description compared to something else, is there another area of the city that you could kind of offer a similar profile of, to say that's how the Inner West differs from this other kind of missiological unit?
Yeah, sure. So I've only lived in two areas in Sydney, what's called the North Shore,
okay,
and the Inner West. So the North Shore is also fairly upper middle class. My parents were migrants to Australia. My dad, an asylum seeker, actually a refugee, in 1956 from Budapest in Hungary. And like many migrant kind of, especially Anglo families, I hesitate to say this, but we had a thing called the White Australia policy in Australia, where we're trying to encourage migration, but only white migration. It's just that's the most horrible thing. I can't even imagine it. Anyway, my parents were part of that. My mum was a 10-pound pom, which meant that all she had to do was find 10 pounds and the Australian government would pay the rest of her relocation to Australia to encourage migrants.
Wow.
They set up on the North Shore because that's where upper middle class people went. Though they were aspirational about that. They weren't that themselves. And so the North Shore is not very progressive. It's much more conservative. It's older money. It's extremely sort of settled, geographically separated. So the houses all are much larger backyards. You can be entirely self-contained in your house. This was true fairly recently. It might be more now, but there are only 3 pubs that were licensed in an area of 400,000 people or something like that. It was quite remarkable just how conservative it was. It was a real sense of, no, we don't want to kind of allow that culture to invade our area.
Right.
And so equally self-righteous, but in a slightly different kind of way. In the where it's not that we're the good people because we are upright and stable. Whereas the Inner West is we're the good people because we're accepting and progressive. So the elder brotherness, if I can put it like that, of both those areas is present, but again it takes a slightly different form.
Sure.
And so to sort of proclaim Christ in a way that says doesn't take that into account would just be in the end be a mistake.
Yeah. So give us an example of that. What would it look like to maybe contextualize the gospel for those different spiritual profiles?
Well, and so there's some things to not do. One of the challenges is to simply enter the culture wars with the gospel and just to go beating people on the head. Right, that just doesn't help at all. And one of the keys, I think that Tim Keller has just done a stellar job, both modelling and also teaching, that to contextualise the gospel requires you first to enter into the culture and to affirm what there is to be affirmed there.
Yeah.
So in relation to the Inner West, where we live, I live at the moment and try and serve, there's a couple of things to say. One is you have to have a very kind of open and curious posture in relation to people that models the same kind of openness and acceptance of whatever to start with. The initial engagement needs to be positive, open, curious, inquisitive, interested. So we run an event each quarter called Wine, Cheese and a Conversation About something, X, and God. We've had all sorts of topics, wine, cheese, and a conversation about mental health and God, or extremism and God, and suicide, and cancer, whatever it might be.
Wow. Yeah.
And the wine and cheese is because we're partly saying we're not afraid, we're not prudish, we can be a little bit progressive. I mean, it doesn't count for much, but it's just a posture of saying we want to enact the value that you have, but find it so very difficult to actually live out, which is conversations with people who have different opinions you value, although you often end up in arguments instead of conversations.
Yeah.
And so we're going to model having a conversation about that. So that's a posture question or a mode.
That's right.
Rather than a content issue. Yeah. I think on terms of contextualizing the gospel in relation to content, there are a couple of issues there. One is the question of rest, as I mentioned before, is because of the nature of the way that life in the inner West works. House prices are so high, double incomes, further study, and kids, and school fees, and the whole package, and fear of missing out, the anxiety about am I providing, and so on. The issue of rest actually becomes a really significant gospel kind of point of connection with the inner West. Rest as a something that you can find for your soul, as Jesus promised it.
Yeah.
In other areas of Sydney, because they're all about rest, that you'd need to speak about rest as an idol.
Yeah.
But in the inner West, it's rest as a possibility because no one's very restful at all.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is because of the nature of the self-righteousness, the question of sin has to be handled in a delicate way, or in a theologically kind of sophisticated way. And I think that Tim Keller has really done a brilliant job of showing how to talk about idolatry as sin as one possibility alongside rebellion as sin. For these very, very confident, self-confident inner West, progressive, pro-justice, pro the environment, pro-Indigenous issues. I mean, they're very, very self-righteous about all this stuff. To talk to them about being, disobedient sinners, it's incomprehensible to them. But if you talk to them about having made something other than God the center and defining, meaning-giving reality of their lives, and it's not working for them, and it's kind of consuming them, and it's sort of eating them up, and that is a form of judgment.
Yeah,
that speaks. And so finding ways to talk about the cross of Christ in relation to idolatry as a freeing of us from the treadmill, the terrible, endless, unceasing treadmill of creation of one's own identity, in serving whatever cluster of idols that there are there. That all becomes really significant in how to speak about the gospel and what God has done for us in the Lord Jesus in a way that will touch people.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. And it prompts me to wonder how a person would get started in a community that they're either currently serving or aspiring to serve. How do you recommend that they get started developing something like a spiritual profile for whatever the appropriate geographic or whatever region is for them?
Some years ago, we worked up a focus group script, actually. So we just did a bit of research on what a spiritual profile might be and thought about that for a little while and put together some questions. We passed them by a fairly established and well-reputed social researcher. Do these questions have too much bias in them, or will they actually? And then actually go out and ask people. That is, because one of the dangers about a spiritual profile is that you end up guessing rather than asking. And the problem with guessing is you end up projecting.
Right.
And then you're just talking to a mirror, and it kind of, you're pretty surprised. You're not surprised at all, actually, what you find out there. It's sort of pretty obvious. So really the only way I think the best way to do it is to just ask questions. Find some people, even if you need to. We did often an invite to come and say, we're genuinely not going to preach at you. We really want to hear what you say. You preach at us.
Yeah.
And we ran a number of these focus groups and got some great results from that. In the end, they kind of confirmed what our guesses would have been, but it was really important not to guess.
Yeah.
And so I'm be happy to share the script with you, and then that might not be useful elsewhere, but that's okay. It's a starting point.
That's right.
But the research is crucial. Not just guessing, not just projecting.
Yeah.
But doing some research and always trying to get at that basic underlying issue of what are the loves? What is it that people are loving, desiring, fearing, rejoicing in, weeping over? That will tell you where the heart is, and that will show you how to preach Christ to them.
Yeah. So you've sort of argued that it's for missiological reasons, it makes sense to focus on these sort of smaller subsidy units within Sydney, rather than saying we're going to win Sydney. You say we're going to dedicate, individual groups of leaders dedicate themselves to particular subsidies. How do you imagine or envision the optimal relationship between the people who are working in the inner west and people who are working somewhere else? To what degree is there a value in a kind of citywide coalition or cooperation if the sort of missiological unit is smaller than that?
Well, I think is a really interesting question, because you just can't. There's just a limit of the number of meetings that you can go to. You know what I mean? You can go to your own church's meetings, and then the local area meeting, and then the citywide, and the national, and the global, and you just end up doing meetings the entire time.
Yeah.
And that is a genuine problem.
Yeah.
We really are trying to promote the sub-city as the unit of movement and mission in Australia. We think there are about 200 sub-cities across Australia. So we don't pray for a movement of the gospel in Australia or for a movement of the gospel in Sydney. We pray for movements, plural, of the gospel. And each of those movements will need a coalition of leaders, as I say, pastors and others, and each coalition will need someone actually who's got some dedicated paid time to actually hold it together, because that's the only way things hold together.
Yeah.
And so we want 200 movements of the gospel in Australia. The reason that there's value for different sub-cities to have connection with each other is that they will learn from each other how to do better contextualization by hearing from the other what they're doing. Because it's often really great to see how someone else is contextualized, not because that's what you've got to do, but because that shows you the kind of thing you ought to do and aren't doing right now.
Right.
And so I remember seeing one of the great Redeemer City resources from years and years ago was a spiritual profile of a Manhattanite. And then not just spiritual profile, but spiritual profile with ministry implications.
Right.
So the profile was, 3/4 of a page long, just, 15 dot points or something. The ministry implications was 3 pages. And it was a brilliant piece of work. And what was really clear was, A, that's what we needed, and B, it wasn't going to be that.
Right.
Because there is nowhere else that's like Manhattan.
Yeah.
And so the spiritual profile of a Sydney sider or the spiritual profile of an inner westie with ministry implications was just going to be different from what it was as a Manhattanite. Yeah. And so seeing what others do will actually show you an example of what either to do or not to do, but it will help you realize what you need to do as well.
Yeah. And
so I think there is a real place for it. But Sydney is a decent sized city, and so nothing on some of the enormous, Indian or Chinese cities. I don't know enough about India and China by any stretch of the imagination, but I can't imagine that they don't function also as vast collections of sub-cities, each with their own missiological edge. And the problem with the idea of city as a whole is if we get 200 people together to talk about reaching Sydney, we'll feel really great about that. Except that's 200 people trying to talk about 20 different movements that are needed, so actually it's tiny.
Yeah, right.
What we need is 20 groups of 200 people getting together.
Right. And
the problem with doing it as a whole city is you think, wow, 200 people in the room, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
It's too small.
Yeah.
And so we've got to take it down, more and more down, and be okay with the fact that it's really in our local area that we need to have focus.
Yeah. To what degree are these kinds of unique personalities of these various subcities, are those relatively long-standing differences, or are they relatively new?
No,
are those subcities becoming more different from each other, or are they becoming more similar?
Yes. To a large degree, they have gotten deeper, although there are also some changes. So Sydney back in the 1950s, of course, was a very different city compared to what it is now.
Yeah.
And so whilst those changes, those realities have gotten deeper in the last 10 years, they've changed enormously in the last 50 or 70 years.
Sure.
And one of the really interesting things about that is particularly the migration question that we talked about before. Yeah. There are some areas of Sydney where there'll be the old version of that area and the new version of that area. And the old version of that area will often be Anglo and elderly. And I've had people say to me, they took my suburb away from me. What they meant by that was government migration policy meant that migrants from a certain country ended up in that particular suburb in significant numbers. And then once there's, birds of a feather stick together, once there's some, then other migrants find their way there and family members and so on and so on. And pretty soon the population structure changes quite thoroughly. Yeah. And, quote, they took my suburb away from me.
Yeah.
And, there was there's a lack of mission heart there because in one sense what you say is God brought the nations to me. How awesome was that?
Yeah, right.
Right, and that's what you want to be saying and to be hearing. But at the same time, you could hear the pain. I mean, it was pain. Yeah. So I think over the long term, cities can really change. Yeah. But as they continue to grow and develop, then these things, I think, tend to get deeper and sort of stronger in their own areas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it does seem that you're saying that instead of the single target of Sydney, you may have 20 targets of these subcities, and then each of those targets is a bit of a moving target. They're shifting over the generations or something over a period of time.
And there's another angle on this, which is this is why when it works, when it's right, long incumbencies within an area actually can be a good thing. So that to have ministers that stay not 5 to 7 years in one place and then move cities or move to completely the other side of the city or something like that, but people who are in their sort of area, even if they move within the area, but are within their sub-city for a long period of time, really soak it up, both love it but love it not too much, that sort of tension, and really get it and have a long tenure within the same kind of place, I think can be a real value because they can morph with those changes, really understand what's going on, provide some leadership for others who come in, and so on. Yeah.
If you imagine Christian leaders in Sydney sort of catching this vision and saying we're going to invest, in deep connection with our various subsidies, what future do you imagine for Sydney if that happens?
Well, what's really interesting is that there's quite a lot of this happening already in Australia, actually, and I'm only new to this, really. There's many others who have been very hard at work at this and have done enormously great work in taking what has always been a kind of a concept, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this phrase, the ministers fraternal. You know that idea? So ministers fraternal is ministers get together for a cup of tea each month.
Oh, sure.
And meet and pray, and it's sort of the kernel of what this might be. Yeah. But instead of the problem with it is it quickly becomes inward looking and relatively and not goal directed at all.
Right.
Instead, if you add to a coalition which has genuine unity based on the recognition that because different kinds of churches are needed to reach different kinds of people, therefore we not just tolerate each other but celebrate each other.
Yeah.
If you add unity and put with unity a goal, and so here's a goal that we're kind of working on, which is to say we think that movement is marked by one church, one healthy, growing church per 1,000 residents.
Okay.
So if you take unity, which is hard enough, and you add to it a goal like that, then that will change. It all snaps into action at that point. And in the inner west of Sydney, there are 260,000 people. There are 130 churches, and they're not all healthy.
Right.
And so suddenly you've just got, here's what we're doing together. We're building with each other. We're praying with each other. We're supporting each other. And we need each of us to plant another church, and we need to help those that aren't so healthy to get healthy.
Yeah.
And we need to start making an impact in the inner West, because there are real social needs in the inner West, which we as a whole, as the Church of Christ, can achieve, that none of us will be able to do individually.
Right.
And that adorns the gospel in a way that becomes, kind of unmissable. And so when you've got church multiplication with planting and regeneration and revitalization, along with justice and mercy efforts that the church does collectively together, then that, I think, has just got a possibility about of a kind of a rolling momentum to see movement emerge.
Yeah.
A movement of the gospel.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew, for your time. It's been a real pleasure to chat with you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
You can find more information about City to City Australia online at citytocityaustralia.org.au. Next week, we have Bishop Raymond Rivera, a longtime pastor in New York City's South Bronx neighborhood and author of Liberty to the Captives. Bishop Rivera offers us a framework for ministry in the context of captivity. You won't want to miss it. How to Reach the West Again is a production of Redeemer City to City. This episode was produced, written, and hosted by Brandon O'Brien. Our associate producer is Braden Gregg. Tim Keller's presentation on city theology was recorded by Andrew Walker. The interview was recorded on location in London by Moises Zetina and Luke Gates of Westway Records. Redeemer City to City is a nonprofit organization co-founded by Tim Keller and supported by generous people like you. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform, leave a review, and consider making a gift to support the work at www.redeemercitytocity.com/give.